So today, I'm going to talk about the 5 things I wish I knew going into my honours year. So I'm currently 6 months into my own honours year, and I wish I had these tips at the beginning of the year so I could have learned how to make things a little bit more practical to set myself up for a year of success. Because it's a crazy year. I'm going insane. So the first tip that I have is around expectations. Now, most of the challenges that you will have with your supervisor will come from a mismatch of expectations. So for example, you have to clarify a lot of issues in the beginning of the year. What will be a research topic? How long will you dedicate to each section? What is the general timeline of your thesis going to look like? How many drafts do you expect your supervisor to read? How involved will your supervisor be? When will your thesis be published? Will it be published? Who will be first author? So what I would recommend as a practical tip in regards to expectations is to get familiar with what you want. Figure out, how much support do you think you need? Do you like working collaboratively, or do you prefer working independently? Do you like to check in once a week, or would you prefer every 2 weeks? Once you come to grips before your first meeting about what you expect from your year and from your supervisor, you can then go into the meeting with an idea of what you want and how you think the year will run, because that is one of the first things that the supervisor will probably ask you about. So at the beginning of my honours year, something that we were expected to do is we were expected to fill out an expectations checklist. Now, the list included many things that you'll have to face during your honours year, such as the things that I've mentioned: publications, draft reads, the kind of friendship that you will have. For example, will you be asking your supervisor about how their weekend was? Will you be having friendly chats about their family, or will it be straight down to business? Some supervisors prefer a really close-knit relationship where they're really kind of exploring that mentee-mentor dynamic. Whereas in other situations, you might prefer something a little bit more distant, a little bit more independent. So it's good to get on the same page about where you stand on the spectrum of collaboration and independence so that you can form a nice understanding of what you can expect from each other during the year. So if you have a look at the expectations worksheet, if you can't get your supervisor to fill it out, or they just don't have enough time, then what you can do ideally is go through it yourself. Go through the expectations that are listed and have a rough idea of where you stand so that you can ask those kinds of questions in the meetings. So that was number 1. Get your expectations in order. Now, my next point is about learning to work independently. Your honours year will be quite different to your coursework year. So in coursework, you're typically given a unit outline by the unit coordinator, which details every element needed to be included in each assignment. You're not going to get that in honours. You will get a general outline about what is expected in terms of your introduction, your method, and your results. But you will not get a structured scaffold, and that is simply because there is such a vast area of research to be explored in honours. You can't map out a scaffold for every single specific study design. A concrete example of this is that you may be marked on your method section. It might say, is clear on method design. But method design will vary from study to study. One person might be using a 3x3 ANOVA. Another person might be using a cross-sectional study. So it really depends. There's so much variation between studies. So while your supervisor will be there to guide you, and you will have a general outline on how your thesis is marked, you will have to take a lot more responsibility and develop more of an independent mindset when it comes to understanding your project. Every thesis varies wildly. Different variables are used, different data sets are used, different analyses are used. You need to learn what your project needs, what needs to be covered for you to get a first-class mark. So while your supervisor, your peers, and your lecturers will be there to help you through your honours process, you will need to develop some elements of independence and confidence in your ability to handle your project, because there are instances where you will have to work in isolation, you will have to work independently, and preparing yourself for that and making sure that you understand that will help you in meeting the needs of your thesis, particularly when it gets a little bit more difficult towards the tail end of the year. The next thing that I wish I knew about is how to manage references. So when you're writing an honours thesis, it is not uncommon to have a reference list of between 100 and 200, depending on your area of research. This can be a big step up from a lot of the coursework that you've done previously. A lot of third-year students have experience with writing essays that are up to 2,000, maybe 3,500 words long. But the honors thesis steps up to anywhere between 8 to 15,000, depending on your university requirements. So what I would recommend is, from the start, get a citation management program. I would recommend EndNote. So here is an example of my very messy EndNote library. It is not that organized, but the point is I have almost every single paper I have used so far in one spot. A major tip in using EndNote is to always download and include PDFs so that you have one place for every single paper. I would always recommend adding in references as you go, updating them and editing them as you go, because further along, it will only pile up and it will get more and more difficult to manage the further along you leave it. So get on it. Get on EndNote. Most universities have it for free. You can download it online using your university software. I've never paid for it. You'll be so much more organized. Now, a big thing that I think a lot of honors students struggle with is figuring out what to do when you finish your thesis. Something that I would recommend doing, even if you don't know what path you're going to take, because it is a difficult thing to manage, figuring life out. But I think something that you should definitely do is get familiar with the options available to you. Now, I live in Australia, so the process that we have here might be different compared to the process wherever you are. So the main two pathways are research or therapy. If you want to do a PhD, the best way to get into a PhD, if you want to do it straight up after your honors, if you're keen on it, if it's your number one priority, is getting first class honors. First class honors means 85% or above, which is a high distinction grade. There are some fields where it may be easier to get into a PhD program compared to others, depending on the universities you're applying to and the availabilities. But typically in Australia, you would need a first class honors to jump straight into a PhD program after your honors year. So this is a research pathway. A lot of people go into this pathway if they're interested in working in academia as a researcher, doing PhD for a couple years, becoming a lecturer, and working in a university. The second pathway is the therapy-related pathway. And this includes both being a generally registered psychologist or a clinically registered psychologist. Now in Australia, you do not need a PhD to be either a clinical psych or a general psych. But what you do need is postgraduate qualifications. However, in Australia, they balance what they require from you in terms of your grade and your experience. So if you want to go through the therapy pathway, so either general psych or clinical psych, then you would typically need a mark of 75, which is a distinction or a upper second class honors, balanced with some sort of experience. And it doesn't necessarily have to be years and years of work, but it might have to be something like volunteering in a lab, volunteering in research studies, doing part-time work, or even a few things on your resume demonstrating engagement and some experience and understanding, as well as practical skills. In the therapeutic pathway, it is an alliance between these two that really helps your application stand out. During your interview process, you will actually be assessed on how empathetic you are, how relatable you come across as a person, how you carry yourself. All of these things are considered in the master's program. So it's not necessarily about getting that first class. My overall recommendation would be to aim for as high as possible, regardless if you are going for a research pathway or a therapy pathway. However, it is nice to consider that if you are thinking about therapy pathway, then the threshold for the mark is a little bit lower, but you might have more on your plate because you're trying to balance doing part-time work, doing volunteering, and doing other extracurricular stuff to build up your resume. So while it's difficult to figure out what you want to do with your life, particularly in psychology, because you often have to commit to 5, 6, 7 years of study if you want to become a psychologist, it is often good to at least, at the bare minimum, be aware of the options available to you so that you can plan out your year accordingly. That way, if you decide 2 months into your honors year, okay, I'm interested in doing therapy work, you can start looking into balancing your time around extra commitments that would support that. The last tip I have is taking ownership of your thesis through curiosity. So this tip is a mindset shift. It is probably one of the most important tips that I can offer in the process of creating a genuine, authentic, insightful thesis. So when you do assignments in a typical coursework structure, for example, in your bachelor's degree, you are in certain constraints. There are boundaries. Your teachers will often be clear on what the limits are and what you're expected to write. They want you to talk within this topic, to not talk about this topic, to go into this much detail, to elaborate on this. And there's guidelines. It's given to you wrapped in a nice box. They are very clear on what they expect from you. While there is a lot of room for critical analysis and critical thinking, the creativity aspect doesn't really come into play until you're in your honors year because there are no boundaries. So there are some boundaries. For example, my own thesis is personality psychology, so I should not go into depth and waste words on cognitive psychology. I have a boundary, but the boundaries are so wide, and it depends on what story, what narrative, what picture you want to paint using your thesis. So this is a tricky thing to put into practice because it sounds so abstract. So what I would recommend is asking yourself two things: how and why. So ask yourself the why and how questions. Why is this topic important? How have other researchers researched it? How should yours be different? Why should yours be different? How should you structure your introduction? Why has the previous literature used the specific analyses that it does? Why do those analyses help with the research question? These questions provide a good base so you can get immersed into the content that you're studying. It can help create an engaging piece of work because at the end of the day, you want your marker to be able to read your thesis and be on the journey with you, understanding as you unfold it step by step. You might even get a publication from it. And journals can be quite stingy with high rates of rejection, so you want to be able to really lay it out. Why are you doing it? And how are you doing it? So, if I could go back in time, this is the list that I would tell myself. If I could go back 6 months before I started my own honors thesis, then this is what I would tell myself to help set me up for success, to make the appropriate mindset shifts, and just to get me ready for what it means to be an honors student. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and until next time.